Hello, Dharma Resistance. Um, all right, I'm gonna hopefully get through this video in about 20 minutes. This is a topic I'm really excited about. So if this is a continuation of kind of maybe tying off the thread of our conversation about movement ecology and theories of change from a couple of weeks ago. And I'm particularly excited about this because we're going to be essentially talking about something we previewed a little bit, the synthesis of the two theories of change that we talked about that focus on changing dominant institutions from the outside. And this synthesis, this particular theory of change, which is called momentum driven organizing, is actually where I spend my days. My time is kind of located in movement building in this space. And I really love this approach. And so I'm excited to be sharing it with you all. So I'm just going to jump right in. So just to quickly review, and I'm going to throw a reminder in that I'm going to put this on YouTube, and that means you can change the playback speed. So if I'm talking too fast, hopefully if you slow me down a little bit, that works. I'll also try to slow down. And if I'm talking too slow, you can speed me up and get through the video a little faster. So reviewing the foundational theories of change from last week. So we have personal transformation, which is focused on kind of change at the individual level, and it might be focused on changing within myself, that kind of idea that change starts within, but also education and, helping people one at a time. It's the personal transformation theory of change, what a lot of, religious communities are engaged in. Alternatives, building, the new world kind of outside, just stepping outside saying, okay, that's all, it's hopeless. We're just going to go out and, try to create a new model that it will be waiting there when the current system kind of fades out. And then wanted to point out the next three share a common thread different from the other two, which is that they're focused on changing dominant institutions. So these three theories of change in different ways. Inside game is trying to change dominant institutions, by playing from the inside and trying to use the rules to rewrite the rules, or, so that's elections, using elections to try to gain power in existing institutions. You can review that video from a couple of weeks ago if any of this is not feeling fresh. And then these last two share the quality of changing dominant institutions from the outside, and they have two historically very different kind of philosophies about how to do that. But what I'm hoping you're going to come away with today is that actually those two approaches are totally compatible and almost just begging to be kind of blended together and lean into the synergies between them. So we can talk about what that looks like just quickly, a little deeper into the structured tradition. This is a really rich tradition of thought. It's, there's practitioners, and it's very deliberate the way that this tradition and this approach to organizing has been shaped. And there's a lot of diversity within this tradition. So these three people on the screen right now, in some ways, they're very, very different approaches. But things that they share is this huge emphasis on one-to-one relational organizing, building sustainable power through durable organizations, building leadership, and essentially what those organizations are is slow leadership development. And generally speaking, a focus on local issues to sort of build up power at the local level. The sort of all politics is local, that idea lives here. And the mass protest tradition, and I have tradition kind of in scare quotes here, which is a little bit unfair. In some ways, this is, of course, very spontaneous. And so it's like, well, is there actually a tradition here? A lot of the people participating in or even instigating mass protests, mobilizations, aren't necessarily rooted in a tradition. But on the other hand, some of them are. And I think there's a risk of underappreciating the presence of kind of strains of thought that aren't necessarily visible to traditional institutions of power. So anyway, there's a mass protest tradition, and it has its own proponents. Pure examples of mass protest, of course, we talked about Occupy Wall Street, the battle in Seattle, the World Trade Organization protests in 1999 is a favorite example. The Arab Spring, I left some dots here, whether or not we'll go into this, but I guess a point is that some mass protests can be astroturfed around the world by, the power of these protests has, like, governments and people in power, including our own regime, the United States, have caught on to how effective this is. And so often it gets used in not necessarily a people power friendly way, but fundamentally mass protest is about people power. A great example is happening right now. is these sort of farmer-led protests in India, as far as I can tell from the outside. And often it's hard to tell, until the dust settles, like what is actually going on when we're seeing this kind of chaotic protest. So it may be more organized than we think, but it looks like a good example of the mass or spontaneous mass protest, radically decentralized and leaderless, meaning, and that's, it operates very, one reason this theory of change operates very well in repressive environments is because, you can't sort of chop off the head. There is no head. There's a focus on really rapid growth. So, you put up a flyer and you say, we're going to be here at this time and everyone come, and, it's just very accessible. People find out about it easily. No other approach has made such effective use of social media for this reason. So it's extremely accessible. And of course, it's focused on shifting the underlying cultural or political terrain. I notice I'm talking a little fast, so I'm going to try to slow down. Just want to kind of get through this because hopefully this feels like review. So if we put the sort of features of these two approaches side by side, it may be kind of clear right away that there is a lot of opportunity for synergy between these two. And it's interesting that, they've really butted heads. Let's say like academics and proponents of these two different schools have really kind of argued back and forth about them in some ways over the last several decades, even as there already were people and have been people for a century using the sort of combined approach. But on the structure-based side, we have this emphasis on developing slowly, one by one, organizing. Again, that's all. I won't reiterate too much here, but you're focused on building alternative power centers of power, alternative to the mainstream, whereas mass protest is kind of more spontaneous and just trying to just shift the culture. But those aren't necessarily contradictory. And there's not necessarily a contradiction between, putting energy into slow one by one leadership development and also making sort of highly accessible gestures towards mobilizing. So a bit of a sort of terminology thing here. Often the shorthand for these two traditions is just organizing and mobilizing. So the organizing tradition, right, is really focused on building human connections, relational organizing, and the mobilizing tradition is just focused on bringing people out. And there's not necessarily a contradiction between those two things, right? So we can kind of look, and I've sort of color coded these. There's the shadows of each tradition. The mass protest tradition has its hostility to leadership, which kind of leads to a disorganized, ultimately disempowering approach to decision making and a sort of inability to absorb the incredible energy that is created in these mass protest instances. And on the other hand, structure-based organizing, often risk averse. And while it does have while the presence of a highly disciplined leadership structure enables rapid decision making, it has a downside too of often, it's held in a way that's kind of exclusive and disempowering, and actually sets, kind of high hurdles to getting involved. So not as effective at engaging people. But just with this color coding, we can really start to see like, oh, how could these two weave together? And fortunately, there's, I think been a lot of progress made in the last couple of decades. I'm going to give credit to Mark and Paul Engler and Carlos Saavedra of the INE Institute for the way that I'm kind of presenting this synthesis and the term momentum-driven organizing. So momentum-driven organizing is the synthesis of these two theories of change. And it seeks to bring together both relational leadership development, so that one by one approach, and accessible mass mobilizing. It seeks to bring together both disruptive, flash in the pan kind of intense protest tactics with a sort of structural power-based approach. So having both of those at the same time and seeing how they feed into each other. Bringing together a sort of disciplined approach to decision-making with structure that's also inclusive and not necessarily, hierarchical in a classic sense where some people have a lot more power than other people and it's kind of hard to break into the inner circle unless you just know the right people or whatever it is. And it uses the sort of intense burst of energy that is so distinct in mass protest, and then tries to draw that energy in to an effective, well-organized structure so that the next flash in the pan can be even bigger. So that is where the term momentum comes from. It's basically, in this theory of change, we're saying, well, we need to make big, drastic change, right? Like I typoed enough. Whoops. We need to make big, drastic change, and we don't have enough power to make the change that we need right now, but we can build that power, which is, kind of the structure idea. But it acknowledges that actually the mass protest, the features of mass protest are actually very effective ways to draw in and build power. So this is called the cycle of momentum, and it's kind of the key feature of the momentum theory of change. And it's pretty simple. It's these 3 steps. So we'll start down in the bottom right with escalation. And the idea is, first, we use that kind of confrontational, disruptive approach to protest that's characteristic of the mass protest tradition. Importantly, it doesn't have to be thousands of people. Even one person alone can take an escalating action to draw attention to the issue, demonstrate some sacrifice, get eyes on it, and people see that, and some people, might, learn about, they might learn about the issue for the first time, but some people will see, oh my gosh, finally someone's doing something about this, and they'll want to get involved. So the key is that escalation, confrontation, disruption is used to draw in new people in the momentum theory of change. So it's about, let's say, one of the main, or maybe the primary reason to do a protest is to draw new people into the structure. And of course, that means you need to have a structure ready to go. So you can't just, before you go do a protest, you want to have a plan of how are we going to promote the protest to recruit new people. Like, let's design a protest that people who haven't necessarily been involved yet are going to want to come to and want to get involved through. And when people see the protest, how can we make sure that if they're interested, we make sure there's a way that they can find out more and they can get involved from seeing the protest. So huge emphasis on using protests to draw new people into the structure. And then once we draw them in, we do classic structure-based organizing. We do, so relational organizing, leadership development. So in momentum theory of change, there's lots of trainings, lots of kind of using, education, building structure, building capacity in the people that we've brought in. And then we use our increased structure to, direct, like now that we have more people, we focus on increasing our popularity, increasing awareness of the issue in the public with our larger organization. So there's a big emphasis, basically we could say the main kind of, again, it's all a cycle, but trying to build active popular support and passive popular support. So the momentum theory of change kind of says, okay, well, we need enough people passively, like we need to win over a majority of the public to support our cause. So in that way, it is focused on culture change. As there's also the sort of power focus, but it's definitely focused on culture change. So we need to win enough passive supporters, which might just be 50% plus one in a democracy, which I would argue America is not actually functioning that way right now, but you can imagine, so maybe in our case, we need 80% of the public to actually, support something before there's much of a chance of it happening in law. And then active popular support is people actively engaged. So drawing them into the structure and then getting them to, be active supporters, talking to their friends, attending protests. And now that we have more people, then our next escalation can be bigger. And the cycle just continues, right? So we're building momentum by using disruption and then drawing people in. So we're kind of toggling back and forth between mass protest and structure, or really they're happening at the same time. Okay, I'm gonna take a breath for myself because I keep talking fast. I somehow feeling this energy of wanting to get through this, wanting to get through this fast for you all tonight. Great. So a couple other features of momentum-driven organizing, kind of already touched on this, but of course, the cycle of momentum is building towards mass disruption while retaining disciplined organizing structure. So because of that, practically any tactic can be used in momentum-driven organizing if we think that tactic is going to either build passive or active popular support. So canvassing, which is meaning just knocking on doors, trying to have conversations about the issue, or going out into a public place and just standing there talking to people on the sidewalk, or guerrilla marketing, writing messages on the sidewalk with chalk, or just almost anything. If it's a way to engage new people into the movement organization, into the movement, get them involved, connect, build the power of the organization so that the next escalation can be bigger and draw even more people, until we actually have enough people that we do have the power we need, the amount of power we need to make big effective change. So pretty much anything's on the table now. Of course, we want to add our commitment to nonviolence into that, but in terms of what fits, what's compatible, the question is just, is there a way, is this going to work to either to draw new people into the organization or to increase passive popular support, so to draw more attention and create more conversation about the issue that we're focusing on. Leadership really is one of the most distinctive qualities of momentum-driven organizing, and because it's all about engaging people, we want that structure to be welcoming. Like we want people's experience of joining the organization to be really empowering, so that they're going to stick around. And so this is what we're going to be talking about much more in our course session on Saturday. But the way that we design the experience of the organization is crucial. And that's really what organizing is all about, is, creating that pipeline so that people, maybe they come in and they come to that first protest, and their experience there makes them really want to stay involved and get more involved and eventually take a leadership position. And that's another key quality of momentum-driven organizing, is that leadership is very accessible. Like if someone joins relatively right away and they want to jump right in and take on a lot of responsibility, of course, we want to gain some trust, and we also don't want people to burn themselves out, but we're not kind of guarded about who gets to be in the exclusive leadership circle. So momentum-driven organizing is kind of a new name, and it concept for breaking down this old debate between the proponents of the structure tradition and the proponents of the mass protest tradition. But it's definitely not a new phenomenon. It dates back at least to Gandhi's movement, where, famously, Gandhi's first mass civil disobedience was a march to salt works, basically there was a ban on Indians harvesting their own salt, which people had done for thousands of years, so that the British could sell them salt instead. And, this did not seem to most people like the most, violent or oppressive or worst aspect of British occupation. But Gandhi knew that symbolically targeting the collection of salt, while it didn't, wasn't the most important way that the occupation was affecting people, he wasn't concerned with, necessarily targeting directly the occupation. He was concerned with trying to shift the culture among the people in India and cause them to sort of activate into, fighting for their own liberation. And it was hugely effective. So people thought, what are you doing targeting salt? And it totally works. That was momentum-driven organizing. That was a huge disruptive action that was really about building the power of the movement. All throughout the civil rights movement, all three of these traditions were present. And looking back, I think a lot of students of the movement would say that the structure thread the momentum thread woven through it that was blending these two approaches, was crucial. And for instance, the sit-in movements, and especially the sit-in movements in Nashville, which were kind of more carefully organized and strategized than a lot of the other sit-in movements for a number of reasons, were a great example of momentum-driven organizing. A very famous example is Otpor, the Serbian revolution group from sort of 1998 to 2002, waged a successful nonviolent overthrow of a dictator. And started with a handful of college kids in some classroom in 1998 who had, basically started doing relational organizing combined with little street theater kind of actions, and spread all around the country, and eventually built into hundreds of thousands of people storming the Capitol. So very classic example of momentum-driven organizing, building from, and that's a great lesson about that is, it can start with one person. If I'm the only person, I can go outside, do something to get some attention, and someone's going to be like, hey, what are you doing? And then maybe that's going to be my second person. And then next we're two people, and we can build from there. And finally, in terms of movements operating today, at least kind of in the West, which I just get a lot more news about because of where I'm situated in the world, I think that Extinction Rebellion in the UK is is a very self-conscious use of this theory of change. They're very aware of this approach, and it was founded on this approach and this terminology. And I think they've kind of executed it marvelously. And anyone who's interested can look more closely at, especially the UK manifestation of Extinction Rebellion, to see what this could look like in practice. And the last thing I want to say is just to tie this to the protests or the direct actions and events that you're all planning, is that you don't have to be, of course, like the theory of change, the momentum-driven theory of change is great when there's a whole mass movement organization organized around it the way Extinction Rebellion is. But you don't have to be in charge of, that's not the only place that momentum-driven organizing works. Even just as a participant in a movement, let's take, since we've been using it a lot, the line 3 the stop line 3 movement as an example. There's lots of people doing all kinds of different actions for stop line 3, and they don't all have to be rooted in momentum driven organizing for your action to be rooted that way. So if someone was doing a solidarity action to stop line 3, you can use momentum. All it means is, in addition to whatever other goals we have for this protest, let's think about how can we get new people involved on the front end? How can we, use this action as a way to get new people engaged in the movement? How can we make sure that the experience of attending the protest actually gets them further involved, so that they're not just, they come to one protest and then they go back home? That's not what, we're building zero momentum if that's what's happening. So we want to find new people and get them to the protest, but we also want the experience of the protest to get them further plugged in. And so thinking about how are you going to design the protest? And again, we'll talk about this more on Saturday. How are you going to design that protest experience so that it's pushing people further into the pipeline of actually, getting really involved in the movement? And then also, how is the protest designed so that people who are witnessing it or reading about it in on news reports or whatever it is, however people might come across your protest, how can you make sure that they have a way to get involved if they're interested? You want to be drawing people in that way too. And of course, that's compatible with lots of other goals that you might have for a protest. And maybe another day, maybe on Saturday, if we have time, we can talk about times when, different reasons for doing a protest, different goals that you might have might collide with each other a little bit. That does happen, but for the most part, these two approaches, very compatible. The synthesis of them extremely powerful. It's the theory of change that I personally am most committed to in my own work. So I think that's all I got. Yeah, great. I hope everyone has a wonderful week, and I'd love to discuss any questions that came up for you watching this video. We'll spend a little time first thing on Saturday doing that. So bring your questions. There we go.